morning, everyone. We're going to continue on with Acts chapter 2. We picked up in chapter 2 where it's the day of Pentecost. Pentecost having a lot to do with the festival of the start of the harvest. And we looked at how this is really representing for us as well, how we have now on this very day been filled with the Holy Spirit, the very Spirit of God, so that we can go out and partake in the harvest. And so it's crucial. And I want us to think about something here. What happens here in Acts chapter 2, after they are filled with the Holy Spirit, it says that they see tongues. We talked about that yesterday, meaning different languages resting on them. And in the power of the Holy Spirit, they go out and begin to preach the wonders of God. So they're declaring the wonders of God. So that's one of the signs that we see about what the Holy Spirit does. This is what Jesus promised. When you in the day, don't even think about what you might need to say. The Holy Spirit will give you the words to say. Doesn't mean we shouldn't prepare and know the scriptures ourselves and study, but that the Holy Spirit still inspires and makes sense of what we're reading. And that's what we see. These guys are now getting out and speaking. The other thing is that, let me just read to you here. It says, chapter 2, let's just go ahead and start to read from chapter 2, verse 1. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. They heard the sound. They heard what sound with this sound. When they heard the sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment because each heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts, Greek, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own languages." Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, "What does this mean?" So I want to just show you something here. When we think about what we just read, right? So you have this area here that is just demonstrating the area where the disciples, where all the people were at in Jerusalem, or where they were from. They were all in Jerusalem, but they were from all of these other areas. So this is the North Africa, Cyrene, Libya, Egypt, Rome, Italy, Europe, Asia Minor, Phrygia, Crete, Pontus, Cappadocia, and Macedonia would be in that area as well. And then you have over here the Parthian Empire, the Mesopotamia, Elamites, Medes, the Parthians, what would be today as far as Iran. So people from all of these areas. So this is, you wonder and you think, how long did it take the gospel to spread? Like Jesus told the disciples, "Go into all the world and you will be my witnesses. You will go into all the world and preach this gospel." Well, how long do you think it took the gospel to infiltrate and get to all of these areas in a day when you had no airplanes or telephones or emails, video chats, social media, vehicles? It was all walking. How long would it take, for it to infiltrate all these areas? Months, years, 20 years, 10 years, 5 years. We read in chapter 2 where it says that the people were amazed and perplexed and bewildered when they saw what was happening. Well, what happens in between the lines here is something that also should amaze and astonish us, because I believe that the gospel went to all of these areas that we just read about in a very short amount of time. I think the gospel covered all of these areas in a matter of months. I would say probably a year. And the reason that I say that it got into all these places and just within a year, is because when you consider what, excuse me just a second. when you consider what we just read, right? All of these people were visiting Jerusalem. They weren't from Jerusalem. They were Jews and converts to Judaism that had come from all of these places for these festivals. And when they arrive, then they're there, but they're not from there. So what would happen in the next few months? They would all start to go back home to Egypt, to Libya, to Cyrene, Cappadocia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, to Asia, to Crete, to Pontus, Mesopotamia, Media, Elam, Parthia, and all the way to Rome. So when these people when they would go back, they would all be taking the gospel back with them. They may not have understood everything just yet, but God had ordained it perfectly so that at just the right time, in just the right place, at just the right moment, Jesus arrives. He teaches these guys for 3 years. He leaves, and he leaves them in a moment when, yes, they are called to go out and be witnesses. But before they even take one single step, God has already performed a miracle of getting the gospel and the knowledge of who he is into the entire empire. There are now people who are believers in Jesus Christ in the next year after Jesus' death, completely infiltrating the entire kingdom. That's amazing, because it tells us that not only were they there, but then Peter gets up and preaches. And when he preaches, at the end of that sermon, 3,000 people believe in Jesus Christ and are baptized. So some of the things that made this very possible, there are 3 things, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing that now. There are 3 things that make it possible during this time. One was called the Pax Romana, right? It was called the Roman peace. There was a period of almost about 200 years where it's known as the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It was a time when Rome was not in active wars, and there was a period of peace over the empire. Doesn't mean that Rome was a peaceful nation, right? They were tyrants, but there was a sense of peace in the sense that there was stability, and that would make travel easier if you wanted to travel. Even with what's going on right now, right? When we were thinking when we were on vacation of going through DC, right? And we're thinking, okay, but what's it like in Washington right now with the protests and everything that's going on? Is it safe to go through Washington, DC? Well, if there were wars going on, it wouldn't be safe to travel. But because there was the Pax Romana, it was a time of peace, it was more stable, and more people would venture to travel from all of those regions to come to Jerusalem. The other is what was the Roman law. Again, the Romans were brutal, but they had a very organized system of laws that we see Paul relate to quite often in the New Testament, because he was a Roman citizen, and being a Roman citizen gave you even more laws. Remember when Jesus is handed over, the Jews arrest him, but they cannot crucify him. They cannot even execute him legally, because only the Romans had the authority to do that. So they had to go to Pilate, because Pilate was the only one who had the legal authority. So the legal rule of law that existed in the Roman Empire also made it easier and better for the gospel to spread. And the other is what we call the lingua franca. So actually there's 4 things. What we call the lingua franca. And the lingua franca is what we would say is the common language, the common tongue. And even though in all of these places that we saw, they all spoke different languages. However, the common language throughout the entire empire was Greek. So you had all these people hearing the gospel in their own languages, right? Where they had been deported from or where they had moved to. Because they were Jews, they also spoke Hebrew. But because of the Greek empire that had spread the Greek language throughout the empire just before the Romans did, Greek was still a common language that you would be able to understand in Israel, as well as in the Parthian Empire, as well as in the Roman Empire. So I'm reading here in English, but the apostles wrote in Greek, and that made it available no matter wherever Paul went, and the others went on their missionary journeys, North Africa or into Macedonia, Greece, Rome. whenever they got to these places, they all had their own languages, but Greek was the common language that would allow him to easily be able to sit down with someone and explain the gospel and tell them about who Jesus Christ is and what he has done and what God's plan is. So you have the Pax Romana, you have the rule of law, and you have the common language. There was 1/4, and that was the Roman roads, the infrastructure, what you would call the the saying, all roads lead to Rome. That's where it comes from. The Romans were master builders, and some of their roads still exist today that you could still use. They didn't just clear out a path. They went down a few inches. They would use gravel, sand, stones. It would perfect so that the water would run off. And that's what made them such a military power as well. One of the things that they were, when you have an empire that's growing and an army and soldiers, tens of thousands of soldiers, you need to get supplies to them. You need to get food to them. You need to get clothing to them. You need to get armor and weapons to them. And so as the army, kind of like our Corps of Engineers, as they went out, they would go building these roads that were very well built. So now you have a time of peace. You have roads that make it much more easier to travel. So maybe a family would say, you know what, let's go ahead and make the trip this year because the roads are better, because there's peace and there's a rule of law, and then because of the common language, it also allowed for a rapid spreading of the gospel. So all of these things combined that are occurring right here in Acts chapter 2 allow for a rapid, very rapid spread of the gospel. And as I said on Sunday, is it just coincidence? I don't think so. I think God, again, in his sovereignty, ordained perfectly. And it's just showing, he's calling them to be witnesses, but even then, he's letting them know before any one of them goes out, God has already brought the people and the harvest to them. Isn't that amazing? And one last thing, and maybe we'll bring this up a little bit more tomorrow, but I just want you to think about it. There's a difference between being a witness and being an advocate or an attorney or a spokesperson. Two very different things. And I'll bring that up tomorrow. We'll talk about that some more tomorrow. So God bless you. Have a great rest of your day.